Today is Thursday, March 1st, and my name is Teresa Ellsworth, and I'm going to be interviewing Katherine Daniels, Farm and Forest Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation and Management in Oregon for many years. And yeah, here we go. So, first of all, I'm going to close the door. Okay. Could you give a brief background about you and your family's settlement and life in Oregon, whether that be starting somewhere else and moving forward?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Southern California in Orange County, and I remember vividly the orange groves that separated all the cities down there, and how wonderful that was, and what a feeling of distinctness that gave to each city down there, each with its own character. And then, of course, as the years went by, those orange groves came down and development went in until the whole of Southern California was a big blob of undifferentiated development. And that kind of broke my heart, but that stuck with me as a child, and I decided by the time I was 12 years old I wanted to go into conservation of natural resources. So I started writing colleges all around the country at 12, asking them if they had a major of conservation of natural resources. And each one of them in turn wrote me back and said, "No, sorry, there's no such thing, that's a hobby. You can't study that." But I was determined and kept an eye open. And by the time I was 18, there were at least 2 colleges in California that offered that major, following, of course, the big environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. So that was Humboldt State College and UC Berkeley. And so I chose the latter and got a degree in conservation of natural resources. Then floundered around a little bit, trying to figure out how that would translate into a job that I might enjoy, and finally figured out that land use planning would be a good fit and a good way to conserve resources, land resources. So I applied to the program at the U of O. I've been to Oregon a couple times, and it was a very green, beautiful place. And so I studied at the U of O and got my master's degree in urban and regional planning there. So that's how I came to be in Oregon, and pretty much decided at that time I was going to stay. Yeah.
And then, can you talk about how you got into the DLCD and actually planning in Oregon?
Sure. Yeah. So while I was still at grad school, I was in a work-study program and worked briefly for Osberg, and really enjoyed that kind of advocacy work. And from there, while I was still in grad school, I did some work for 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which is a land use advocacy law firm, and really enjoyed that. And that brought me my first familiarity with the land use planning program, because it was all about reviewing each of the comprehensive plans and set of ordinances that were being submitted to LCDC for compliance with the statewide planning goals. So I was a plan reviewer there for about 2 years. And
what year was that?
Let's see, that was 79, 80. There were probably just a couple of us, but I worked with a team of phenomenal lawyers who were really my mentors, and those were Dick Benner, Bob Stacy, Mark Greenfield, and those are very prominent names who have really been fundamental in shaping the land use planning program. So I was really lucky to be able to work with them as a young person. So we commented on the comprehensive plans and ordinances, mostly those for counties. That was my own interest, counties more than cities. Commented on them along with others and submitted our comments to DLCD. And so that was really interesting work. And then after a couple of years, I was contacted by one of the supervisors of the plan reviewers at DLCD, who asked me if I wanted to apply to work there. So I did. So I started working at DLCD. I worked there initially for 4 years as a plan reviewer, and it was really the highlight of my career. It was wonderful. It was heady. It was like riding the crest of a breaking wave. It was a new, innovative program. There were a lot of young people in the agency, maybe no more than 30 of us all together for the whole state. We were just a team that worked together, mostly in our late 20s, early 30s, and it felt like really productive, gratifying work. And I reviewed mostly county plans. It was controversial, though. It was very controversial, especially the farm and forest land policies that required some pretty rigorous protection of the farm and forest land base. That was controversial. Yeah. And in some cases, there was a lot of pushback on the part of counties. I mean, planning and zoning was relatively new for rural Oregon, and to have to abide by some pretty rigorous standards restricting uses and involving large minimum lot sizes, about 40 acres in the valley at that time, was hard for them and hard for their constituents. And sometimes there was pushback, and some counties just refused to do it. And DLCD did have an enforcement tool, however. They could withhold state revenue funds, revenue sharing funds. They could also just shut down planning departments and not allow them to issue any permits at all, even some building permits.
Did that happen?
That happened. Yeah, that happened. Maybe 16, 18 times, something like that, throughout the state. And that brought the counties around very quickly. Not as controversial with cities, although the urban growth boundary issue could be controversial, but most of the controversy out in the rural areas. So it was challenging that way, and as an employee, you tried to be very fair in the work that you did. Working for DLCD, then I was in a position to review Thousand Friends comments. I have to say too, when I first started working at DLCD, there was a little kerfluffle because I had been working for Thousand Friends, and that was viewed suspiciously by some counties, some property rights people, the Home Builders Association. And there were some headlines in the newspaper. I still remember one, I've got a copy, "Fox Guarding the Chicken Coop," and that sort of thing. So there was protest at the governor's office. They wanted to cancel my contract, but Governor Atiyeh at the time supported me in staying at the agency. So I did.
Can you talk about some of the reasons why we want to conserve our farmland and our forest land here in Oregon?
Sure, yeah. Well, many communities around the country plan for the urban areas. They proactively plan for the urban areas, and they just ignore the rural landscape, the working landscape. It's really just viewed as leftover land that ultimately will be developed, so we're not going to make any proactive decisions about how it should be managed in any way. Oregon just decided that we needed to not only plan for growth and development in our urban areas, but plan to maintain and protect the working land base in our rural areas, because agriculture and forestry, even today, are still our number 2 and 3 economic sectors. They're still very important to the state's economy. We also export 80% of the agricultural products we grow, which is good for our economy. Going back to what I said about the orange groves in Orange County, you know, the farmland helps to distinguish different communities around the state. I can guarantee you that without this planning program, you would see sprawl from Portland all the way down to Salem, because this is primo development land. It's flat, it's very buildable. Portland to Salem, Salem down to Eugene, and even further south. It would all be one massive development. So part the reason as well for protecting farm and forest land is to protect the habitat. We've got big game habitat, other types of habitat, wetlands, and so on that are often part of farm and forest properties that are protected. The program had the active support of the Farm Bureau, which is a little surprising because there are a lot of traditional, very strong property rights feelings among rural landowners, but they really got behind the bill. And instrumental in that was the leadership of Hector McPherson, a Lynn County farmer who was also a legislator. And of course, Governor Tom McCall at the time, who was just inspirational. So those are some of the reasons for protecting farmland. Also, there was throughout the 60s, there was quite a bit of population growth in Oregon, a lot of it from California, and it was perceived as a threat. And it wasn't that Oregon and the leadership was against the development, but they wanted to see balanced development. They wanted to see most growth and development be channeled into and around urban areas, and allow the farm and forest sectors to continue to operate without interference.
Can you talk about some of the unique soils in Oregon?
Well, sure. So agricultural soils are rated by the Natural Resource Conservation Services 1 through 8 in capability, with 1 being the most capable. And because the Missoula floodwaters in antiquity, came rushing down the Columbia River and down through the Willamette Valley, we have some wonderful, wonderful soils. Quite a bit of class 1 and 2, 3 soils. But what's interesting about the Oregon Farmland Protection Program is that we protect not just what are called prime soils by the NRCS, which are pretty much all of class 1, most of class 2, and some of class 3. We protect all of 1, 2, 3, and also all of 4 in the valley, and then we protect 1 through 6 in eastern Oregon. I don't think that's true anywhere else in the country. And it's really helpful because if you look at the soils on a given farm, it looks like a mosaic. With a variety of different soil capabilities, and if you're just protecting the very, highest quality soils, you're potentially not protecting a good chunk of a given farm. So, also instrumental in helping the state to determine which are the best soils to protect was the early viticulture in the state, the early wineries, and they actually lobbied for the protection of class 3 and 4 soils that otherwise might not have made the prime cut. And today we've got just a vibrant viticulture industry, wineries. And those are more on the hillsides, lands that are typically not protected in other parts of the country. So yes, we've got great soils, but we also have made an effort to protect even those soils that are not the highest quality, as long as they're capable of producing agricultural crops.
Could you talk a little bit about the spotted owl and sage grouse habitat and any other threatened species that are impacted by the work that the Land Conservation Group has done?
Okay, well, it's a little out of my territory. That's interesting because those are Goal 5 resources, other non-working land resources, and I didn't have too much to do with that sort of work, but I will say that the farm and forest land protections definitely do a lot to protect those habitats because of the limited uses that are allowed in exclusive farm use zones and forest zones, and also because of the very large minimum lot sizes. Today, the minimum lot size throughout most of the valley, with a few exceptions, is 80 acres. So a 150-acre parcel could not be divided into 2 parcels because each parcel would not be a minimum of 80 acres. So those large parcel sizes and limited uses really help protect the land base, which is good for many kinds of wildlife habitat. Sometimes there's a little bit of a conflict, like with sage grouse habitat and range land where they're not necessarily on the same soils. For instance, when I was doing the review for the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line corridors, my interest was trying to keep those lines off of especially the high-value agricultural land. Well, that inadvertently, I wasn't aware at the time of the sage-grouse issue, that I think pushed the lines more into the sage-grouse habitat off the high-value farmland. So sometimes you can't have it all, and you have to make make hard decisions about what resources to protect. But I will say that the Goal 5 protections in the land use planning program are fairly weak. They are very reliant on the farm and forest zoning, we don't have the kind of protections that about half the states in the country have. What people call the mini NEPA process, kind of miniature National Environmental Protection Act process, which requires a site-by-site analysis of environmental values before development occurs, at least before large development occurs. We don't have anything like that. We have more of a broad brush, macro approach to Goal 5 protections, and it just doesn't focus in on individual parcels very well. So that's definitely a weakness in the program. Yeah.
In terms of that transmission line, what are the concerns for farmland versus the sage-grouse habitat in putting a large transmission line? Is it largely trucks coming in and clear-cutting the way for the transmission line and destroying that habitat and then having to come in and do work? Are there other issues regarding radiation or just what issues are involved?
No, I don't think the radiation. I think it's the physical land changes that are made in preparation for the lines that go in. I think that's primarily it. Of course, as far as farmland goes, those lines can be problematic for aerial spraying. I was especially interested in the Treasure Valley out in Malheur County, which has really high, you wouldn't think so, but there's really high quality agricultural land out there. A lot of class 1 or 2 soils, and a lot of onion growers out there. I was especially interested in getting involved in that. Nobody asked me to do it. I was getting letters from the onion growers. And I thought, Eastern Oregon counties have not always been big fans of the program. They see it as Portland and Valley oriented, and a lot of these counties are much closer to Idaho, which has very little in the way of land use planning. So when they appealed to us, I thought we need to stand up and do something for them. And I think we surprised the power companies in getting involved in it, but they did change the route of the lines, which is gratifying. So
I actually have a copy of the map of the line.
too.
And I was just wondering if you could tell me where it was before.
Oh my goodness, it's been many years. I don't know if I can.
It's okay. I can probably find it online.
Yeah, I don't think I can remember, but I will.
Okay.
I will say, this is interesting. This is interesting though, because I do notice one thing, and that's that the earliest rendition of this line was so annoying to me, because what it did was it went from Boardman down a ways, and then it cut over to Idaho, and then back into Oregon, and down and back into Idaho. And I knew darn well what they were doing. They were going for the low-hanging fruit. They knew that Oregon had wide open spaces with very little development, which makes it much easier to put transmission lines in, whereas Idaho had not done hardly any planning at all, and the whole area is riddled with rural residential development. Mm-hmm. And that I know that the company knew that they would get a lot of pushback from landowners who would say, we don't want transmission lines in our backyard. Why else would they come all the way over to Idaho, back into Oregon, and then back again to Idaho? Mm-hmm. That really got me flustered. So it looks like they're not doing that anymore. That's good to know. I mean, yeah, good to know. One other thing about this whole process that that concerned me was that each county had its own concerns. Either they thought it was wonderful, or they didn't think it was wonderful, or they thought it should be rooted maybe somewhere else, but there was no regional planning process. And that is something that, that the Oregon Landis Planning Program lacks. We have a regional problem-solving process that's been used a few times to actually solve a problem, but not to prevent a problem, not to plan for a coordinated effort that involves several counties. Mm. Now that's something that some other states do have. They don't have the other aspects of our program that are really fundamental, like farm and forest land protection, but that is something we could benefit from. Yeah, that's about all I remember of that.
Okay. So it sounds like you mainly worked on farmland and not as much on forest land?
Well, when I was doing plan review during the first 4 years I was at DLCD, I did county reviews, so I did all the goals that pertain to the county reviews, but the urban-related goals weren't weren't major goals for the counties. Yes, they did have rural communities, and they could develop some infill and that sort of thing. With farm and forest, I reviewed both of those for farm and forest.
So there are a couple sustainable logging programs, the Forest Stewardship Council and then Sustainable Forestry Initiative. I was wondering if you could talk about those in Oregon. Are they being used? Do you think that they're particularly effective? And what's the adoption rate like?
Boy, I'm really not familiar with those because they have to do with forest, with timber management and cutting and that sort of thing. And I was really exclusively involved, and the program is really exclusively involved in maintaining the base of the forest land.
Okay.
But it's been interesting because at the beginning of the program, we had some real pushback from some of the forest industry, not the State Department of Forestry, but some of the corporate industry. And they were behind a couple of ballot measures to try to undo the whole program. So we had mixed reaction from the forest industry. Yeah, no, I really can't speak to that.
Okay.
No, sorry.
Well, let's go, so we kind of cut off at your first 4 years of planning, but can you talk about your experience after that time?
Sure. Well, after 4 years, I married and became a trailing spouse. And we lived in the Midwest, on the East Coast, in Kansas, Iowa, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, home to the Amish, where there's terrific farmland resources, and in upstate New York. So that gave me the opportunity to work in a lot of other capacities for the public sector, the private sector, not-for-profits, and so on, and was really kind of opened my eyes. For the first time, I worked for the private sector and got to be on the other end of the stick and actually have to write comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances instead of reviewing other people's. So that taught me a little humility, I think. But from a distance, I could really see how unique Oregon's program was, because there was no place that I saw that was doing anything like what we were doing. They might talk about 10-acre minimum lot sizes, which is probably worse than nothing at all. And it just brought home to me again and again how unique and effective, and how highly effective Oregon's program is. And I have to tell you a little story that's kind of funny. When we moved to Lancaster County, I applied at the county planning office for a job, and put in my application, and the next morning I got a call from the planning director who said, "You got it." I said, "You never met me or interviewed me or anything. How did that happen?" And he said, my name is Ron Bailey. I'm the former planning director for Josephine County, Oregon, and I know you. I know who you are. And I thought, oh boy, it's payback time now. Because this was the county that got an enforcement order. This was the county with whom DLCD, and that was one of my assigned counties then. And it was definitely a challenging relationship with me saying, you need to do this, this, and that. And I thought, oh boy. So I took, but he hired me. And what was really interesting is it turned out that Lancaster County was a county that actually had some good ag zoning. And Ron Bailey brought urban growth boundaries to Lancaster County. After all that pushback, there was apparently some kind of learning curve there, and ultimately he appreciated what he saw in Oregon, and he brought urban growth boundaries to Lancaster County. And Lancaster County today has EFU zoning, urban growth boundaries, and it also has a state county purchase of development rights program for easement acquisition on farms, and a private program as well, and they have over 100,000 acres in permanently protected forever under easement. Those are a couple tools we don't have here yet, but some of us are working on them. So that was interesting. Then after my boys were grown, I decided to move back to Oregon, and Ron was my predecessor who'd been in the position of Farm and Forest Land Specialist for 30 years, forever, from the beginning of the program, and whom I interviewed on Tuesday this week. He was retiring, and so I applied for his job, and I got it, and that was the Farm and Forest Land Specialist. So I did notice that I asked myself whether I really wanted to do this, because I knew that the agency would be in a different phase. And it was in more of an administrative phase, an administrative and helpmate phase to communities, as opposed to an innovative enforcement, startup phase early on. So, but it worked out fine. I ended up doing mostly kind of a combination of technical assistance to counties. County planners would call me, landowners, lawyers, and others would call me, and they'd want to know exactly the meaning behind some statutory provision or rule provision. Because by that point, when I left the agency originally, there were no rules, no agency rules. There were just fairly generalized goals. But by the time I came back, there were some very specific rules for many, not all of the goals, especially farm and forest. I know a lot of very specific rules, and then I would help interpret them. The other thing I did was help develop new policy. When I would see that there was a problem in the field, some use that was allowed in statute was being misinterpreted again and again and again, I'd think, maybe we need to clarify the rules. Or there'd be significant court cases that would come down, and the courts would say, DLCD, you need to create a definition for this use, or your review standards need to be clarified, and then that would be the basis for rulemaking. So I did some technical assistance and some policy work, some work out in the field. I also noticed there were some new issues that had kind of arisen over the long span of time that I was gone. One, alternative energy was a big deal now. That's one of the goals that really never kind of developed and never accrued any rules to it. It's basically an energy conservation goal. And it wasn't anticipated in the mid-70s that there would be alternative energy sources at some point. So in recent years, the department has developed and adopted rules for wind energy development and solar energy development. But they never did go back and actually make changes to the goals themselves. To change the goals would be really hard, because we would have to go all over the state and hold extensive public hearings the way we originally did many years ago. And that was a monumental effort. So anyway, alternative energy has been a big issue. Solar continues to be very controversial, because although the rules provide some significant advantages and benefits to siting solar east of the Cascades on less good agricultural land, the pressure is in the valley, and people are wanting to develop those in the valley where they're closer to more transmission lines and that sort of thing. So I think DLCD is in the midst of making some tightening up some of the rules to do with solar energy.
I was wondering, a lot of cannabis growers, they grow inside. Are there provisions for if photovoltaic farms are on top of cannabis facilities that might also be located on prime soil, but they're actually using greenhouses or indoor facilities on prime soil to farm?
Yeah, the cannabis issue was just getting going about the time I left.
Okay.
And I don't believe there would be limitations on indoor, buildings for indoor growing in farm areas. There were limitations put in statute on dwellings in conjunction with these new operations, because there's an income standard for farm dwellings, and you have to be able to show that you have met $80,000. You have grossed $80,000 a year for a couple of years. It's not a problem at all for a cannabis grower, and so our concern was that numerous very small parcels were going to get dwellings, and that would kind of overload the landscape with dwellings that could be a conflict for other farm uses. So I do remember that was an issue. There's a lot of issues, especially down in Jackson County, but I haven't kept abreast of them since I've left. Yeah.
What are you up to these days? Are you working with 1,000 Friends?
No, I am working with a kind of a loosely organized group. We call ourselves the Working Lands Collaborative, and it's there's not an official membership list, but about a year and a half ago, a large group of folks who have been players from the very beginning of the program came together. A lot of us retired with an emphasis on the farm and the forest land aspect. And we got together for a dinner, and then some of us said, hey, we should continue to meet and see if there's some issues that we want to work on. Some of us have done that. And so there's a little kind of core group that I'm part of, and we're each sort of pursuing our own thing. And one of the members, Nellie McAdams, who works with Rogue Farm Corps, she's pursuing the angle of permanent land protection through easement acquisition. Half the states in the country have a PDR program, which is what it's called. We don't, because we've been so reliant on the EFU zoning. But ultimately, it's impermanent. All it takes is one legislative session to undo of legislators who don't support it, and it would be undone. So that, I think, is a really good direction to go, especially if those easements could be placed at the perimeter of urban growth boundaries in the direction you don't want the growth to grow, in the direction of the most productive farmland. Because there's never enough money in PDR programs to acquire enough land to protect a critical mass of farmland, so you want to be strategic about where you put it. So she is really spearheading that. She got a bill through the legislature last year on that. That's a great future direction, I think, for Oregon to go. And it's not really a mandate of DLCD. It'll probably be too much for them. But the land trust community could be instrumental in acquiring easements. There are federal farm bill funds available to do that. The other things we're doing, one of the professors here, Megan Horst, is following up on cumulative impacts of non-farm uses on farmland. There's been over 22,000 new dwellings in EFU zones across the state, mostly in the valley since 1985, and many more previous to that, as well as other uses. And at what point does that tip the balance and make it no longer feasible for farmers to continue to farm? Because there are over 50 uses allowed in the EFU zone. In the early 70s, we started with 6. Almost every legislative session, the legislators add another use or two. I wish they could restrain themselves. Over 50 uses. Dwellings are the key problem. Also, some agribusiness. some agritourism. Agritourism can be a great supplemental stream of income for farmers, but at some point it can become the tail wagging the dog. Like is a wedding venue on 10 acres with flower-themed, processions. Is that really agritourism? Enough of that sort of small-scale use can raise the price of land for farmers who want to start out actually farming or want to acquire additional land to expand their farm.
Are there any other impacts due to agritourism other than the land price increase?
Well, sure, they can increase traffic quite a bit. Look at Sauvie Island. Sauvie Island is a perfect example of an area that is half of it's like a bird refuge and the other half was historically farm. And now it's just so full of farm stands, agritourism, that it's definitely become the tail wagging the dog. It's got gridlock traffic there all through the summer. So also noise can actually impact milk producing for dairy herds. People have had weddings next to farms that have been in the middle of spraying manure for fertilizing, and they've actually run after the farm machinery, yelling and complaining about it. As I said, there's legitimate agritourism that provides a supplemental stream of income, but when it becomes the primary source of income for a property, then you're not really helping farmers. And the EFU zone is intended to be primarily for farmers.
I know that some farms at Sauvie Island are no longer allowed to have weddings. Do you think that in the next few years they'll limit the agritourism that can happen on Sauvie Island altogether?
Well, Washington County has been looking at this for some years. I know that, and you have to remember that wedding venues is not a permitted use in farm zone. So the way people are getting it is kind of they're either applying for temporary use through counties, but if it's temporary use that continues on a regular basis, you have to really wonder whether that's a legitimate way to approve a use like that. Or they're sometimes getting it as a home occupation. Well, home occupation under statute has to be carried out primarily indoors. And a lot of these wedding venues are primarily outdoors. Or people are calling it agritourism, but even agritourism in statute has specific standards connecting it to and making it subservient to the primary agricultural use. So in my opinion, most of the wedding venues that are out there on EFU have really kind of skirted the law. And some counties have allowed them to do that. Some of them have not even gotten permits, and unless someone turns them in. Most counties don't do enforcement except on a complaint basis in Oregon. So unless somebody complains, then sometimes that just happens. So, and again, it's an issue of cumulative impacts. It's nice to get married outdoors. Wineries are allowed, I think something like 17 or 18 events a year. So, and a lot of them have chosen to have those events wedding events, so they can do that now. So there is some room for that kind of thing.
There's a lot of concern in Oregon about seismic and tsunami risk. Do you think that the locations of fault lines or risk of tsunamis should impact where urban centers or small towns are located? Do you think that?
Well, DL City has been involved in tsunami planning for several years now along the coast. They're doing some really good work there. The coastal management work is done in DLCD, and it's part of the federal system of coastal zone management. I haven't been involved with that, but there's been talk about moving key infrastructure and key utilities and services like schools and hospitals up gradient. or even moving entire communities, like Seaside. Some of them are more vulnerable than others. So definitely a lot of work going on in that area along the coast. As far as the planning program goes, otherwise away from the coast, no. I mean, there's the Office of Emergency Management here in the state, and that's really their thing. They're doing that. Yeah.
I'll just ask, you have a lot of notes here. Are there things that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, well, let's see. Sure. So of the statewide planning goals, I think that goals 3 and 4, agricultural and forestry, together with 11 and 14 have been the most significant goals and the most successful goals, also the most controversial goals. That sort of thing goes hand in hand. But 3 and 4, again, is so unique, the kind of protections we have on farm and forest land. 11 and 14, 14 is the urbanization goal, requires urban growth boundaries to contain 20 years worth of future development needs. 11 goes very closely together with that because it prohibits the extension of urban services outside the UGB lines. So that really helps minimize the conversion of resource lands outside of the UGBs. Those are all instrumental in, although there are other places in the country that have urban growth boundaries, without the concomitant farm and forest land zoning outside those boundaries, they're just going to develop into 1 or 2 acre lots, and you're not going to have that distinction and that protection. The goals with the least, that have been the least important, I think, or the least utilized, are certainly goal 6, protection of air, water, and land resources. But when you think about it, that's really the province of the Department of Environment and Quality. So the department never did anything with them. It doesn't have any, we reviewed those during the acknowledgement process. We reviewed that goal, but everybody complied with it because it doesn't really have to do with land use planning. Goal 13 was really oriented to energy conservation. No rules were ever developed for it. So that was also really underutilized. All the other goals were basically, housing, economic development, transportation. Those were the kind of things that cities did anyway. So the goals didn't really impose much more, in the way of work on communities for that. And the goals clarified that the needs for housing, commercial and industrial really need to be met in urban areas, so those were only minimally addressed in rural areas. In the early days of the program, when there were just the goals, there was a lot of loose interpretation on the part of local governments, especially the counties, in how to interpret the farm and forest land protections. So with those loose interpretations, there were then a lot of court challenges that followed, and the courts really forced the agency to adopt rules and become more specific. And often people have criticized the program for being too complex. But a lot of it is the result of heavy adjudication over the years. And I do think that the statutes and the rules, as they apply to land use, could really benefit from a recodification. They could be much more reader-friendly, user-friendly, for one thing, and they could also be better organized, and some aspects of them could be simplified without losing a lot of the rigor. So, but it's hard to be clear and simple at the same time, and that's been kind of a struggle. I think citizen involvement has been key from the beginning of the program, especially prior to goal adoption, and really making the process legitimate and making people aware of what was happening. And today at the local level, decision making is pretty transparent. It's required to be. There's certain procedural requirements that have been in effect for a long time. A lot of decisions used to be made behind closed doors because some public official knew some landowner. There's a lot more in the public light now, and I think that was really that transparency holds locals more accountable, and that continues today. And it was essential for a program that involved some pretty rigorous new standards that citizens had full access to information, in public hearings, information prior to meetings, what was being addressed, opportunities to make public comment, and that sort of thing. So I think that's been a good aspect of the program.
Do you think that citizen involvement has changed a lot over time, and we're kind of experiencing another large influx of people from other places? Do you think that that's having an impact on levels of citizen involvement and education? I
really do, and that was something I wanted to talk about too, because in the early days of the program, there was a pretty high degree of acceptance after a certain number of years among people who were familiar with the program. But today, over half the people who live in this state weren't here back then, and they either were newly born here or they moved here from elsewhere. And I've talked to a number of people who are smart, educated, and they've never heard of the program. So I think while people think of Oregon as having an environmental reputation, it's actually more of a land use reputation than an environmental reputation. People appreciate the wide open spaces. I know they do, but I don't think they make the connection between the fact that these are actually working landscapes and how hard we had to work to get those in place and how hard we still have to work to keep those protections there. I often felt when I was at the agency like I was like a little Dutch boy with my thumbs in the dike. Because if people aren't aware of the protections that exist, why this land looks like it looks, functions like it functions, then they're not going to contact their legislator to tell them vote yes on this land use bill or no on that one. And the legislators, as a consequence, are not going to necessarily care themselves. And having been here at the beginning of the program and recently, I've really noticed an alarming lack of familiarity with the program on the part of legislators. Because I was involved with the legislative sessions and I would review bills that came in, and they would use terms like planning and zoning very loosely, and you'd think, oh, well, what are they trying to do here? Even just trying to figure out what they're trying to do. Like, is this a bill that would preempt the statutory rule provisions? It's like this, like a notwithstanding the goals, we're going to allow this, and it was like, you couldn't understand what they were getting at because they never called the agency. They almost never called the agency to say, I want to do this, how should I word it? This is what I want to do. Almost every legislative session, the legislators add another use or two to the list. Some constituent says, I want to have fireworks stands in EFU zones, and so it's in there. It's in there now. And the legislature also sometimes does supersiding. It allowed a 500 unit, resort in Grant County a few years ago, which no other county is allowed to have. It was like a one-off. It's unfair. It's unfair. It's perceived as unfair by other communities. So the people criticize DLCD for being overly restrictive or unfair, but often it's the legislature that is problematic. So I worry there's a complacency, and people take the grant program for granted, and there's not education. DLCD has never gotten money for education. It's felt, the legislature feels like we'd be patting ourselves on the back. But that's what I'm interested in, actually. That's what I'm doing in retirement, is trying to get more into education. And I did just get 2 grants that would allow me, together with Ag in the Classroom, which is an organization that provides curriculum related to agriculture to schools throughout Oregon. We're developing an activity for the outdoor school. Are you familiar with the outdoor school? For 5th and 6th graders, a hands-on activity involving a raised relief map, little blocks representing different kinds of development, and challenge these young people to decide where development should occur in a way that best protects farmland, forest land, wildlife habitat, steep slopes, floodplain, wetlands, and in groups and teams, and I'm excited about that. Because if they get a feeling for the issues at that young age that adults are talking about constantly now, it'll prepare them for those decisions. And there won't be any right or wrong answers. These teams will come up with different approaches, but they'll at least be able to discuss the pros and cons of developing here versus developing there. And so, we just got the full funding yesterday for it, and I'm excited.
Congratulations.
Thanks to do that. I think that's a very important. Education is just key for the long-term survival of this program.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with future planners, residents, anyone else interested in effectively planning Oregon?
Well, let's see, sure. I'd like to say that the statewide planning program never envisioned a statewide plan or statewide zoning, and there is no such thing. It was always meant to be a partnership using state policies, state standards, but allowing a certain amount of flexibility for cities and counties to develop their own approaches to these issues. So I feel that it's been a pretty good balance of state and local interests. Not everybody agrees, but that was certainly the intent, never that there would be a statewide plan. So I think that's important. There have been a number of entities that have been critical in advancing the purpose of the program, as well as entities that have repeatedly tried to undercut the program. I think that's worth mentioning. Of course, Tom McCall, absolutely pivotal, our earlier governor, very inspirational. Just to hear a video or an audio of him talking to the 1973 legislature is really great. But as I said, the Farm Bureau was behind the program. The Oregon home builders were behind the land use planning program. And the reason for that was that they had often run up in the past against wanting to develop in a certain area, and the community wouldn't have the land zoned properly, and it cost the home builders time and money to get the land rezoned. So the deal still is that cities would have to show that there was adequate vacant buildable land provided in advance within the urban growth boundaries to meet 20 years worth of future needs. So the home builders knew that they could go in and there would be land available. They didn't have to go through any rezoning. Granted, they wouldn't be able to build outside the urban growth boundary by and large. So, but it was a give and a take kind of thing. And they actually went along with the program, which is really amazing, I think, in some respects. Another key entity was 1,000 Friends of Oregon. Because what they did was, whenever, in the early years, when DLCD would acknowledge a comprehensive plan and a set of ordinances that 1,000 Friends didn't feel met the letter of the law, they would take them to court, and 9 times out of 10, literally, 1,000 Friends would win. So 1,000 Friends was instrumental in keeping DLCD's feet to the fire, absolutely, during those early years until DLCD kind of got it.
Are they still that active?
They are, they're kind of like the DLCD now. They're more in sort of a helper mode, trying to provide a friendly assistance to local communities in a variety of issues, big on transportation and big on housing, affordable housing. So they're certainly not exclusively farm and forest oriented. So we've also had some key DLCD directors over time, especially Dick Benner, my former mentor at 1,000 Friends. Also Lane Shetterly, some of these key people, and periodically strong LCDC members. On the other hand, as I mentioned, some of the forest industry and some legislators have tried to undercut the program a little bit. And of course, the Oregonians in Action. I don't know if you've heard of that group. It came about, I think, in the early 90s. That is a very strong property rights group. Dave Honeycutt is its head. He's very articulate. He's very smart. He speaks for a lot of property owners, and he's constantly proposing new bills. In every legislative session, there's probably at least half a dozen, if not 10 bills that try to undercut the program, usually the farm and the forest land parts of the program. And it's like it takes up a lot of DC's time to try to push back against that. The agency in the beginning was more proactive. Today, I see it as being a little more reactive, which I think is a little bit of a shame. It makes you look defensive when you're just kind of waiting for problems to come to you rather than kind of stepping out and anticipating issues. I'd like to see it be a little more proactive. Years ago, there was a lot more media support. Editorials, op-ed pieces, constantly supporting the program. Today, silence from the media for the most part. Of course, the Portland Oregonian has become much more conservative. But if you hear about the program, it's usually in a very controversial, specific aspect, and that's a little disappointing to me. I have a little list of things that I would change, if I could. Okay. There was a ballot measure passed some years ago called Measure 49 that has resulted in about 6,000 properties being able to develop dwellings that otherwise wouldn't have been able to, without getting into details. But it also looks forward in that it requires that if any future zoning change would reduce the value of a property by any amount, there has to be compensation. And that has had a chilling effect on creative, innovative zoning ideas across the board. And it's going to cripple us going forward in terms even of making compromises or trying to have a little give and take. Just crippling. About half the states in the country have this sort of thing now. And I think it's really unfortunate because zoning has always created winners and losers to some degree. And I think the program has tried to be fair about it. I think it would be good to allow land use needs to be met on a regional basis and not necessarily every city have to provide 20 years worth of growth and development. Some cities want to grow more than others. Some cities like Woodburn is completely surrounded by class 1 or 2 agricultural soils. If some other city would rather, surrounded by poor soils, would rather pick up that growth and development, why not? There's no provision in the program that would allow those needs to be met regionally. Cumulative impacts of non-farm uses on farmland need to be looked at. Goal 5 rules need to be strengthened. There's been a fair amount of sprawl within UGBs. That needs to stop because if you're sprawling within your UGB and not having a little bit of density, you're going to need to expand that much sooner. And the county comprehensive plans need to be updated. They're from the early 80s. They don't get any periodic review money. Only the cities bigger than 10,000 people do. So they need to get their share of money. Situations, circumstances change for them too. Yeah. So one other I guess some of the strong points of the program, I would say, are the specificity of the standards, the state oversight, the inclusivity of citizens in the process, and two things I haven't mentioned. One is LUBA, the Land Use Board of Appeals, which is kind of like an appellate court that receives only land use cases. It's a very specialized court. I don't think there's anything else like it across the country, and I'm really glad it developed because the land use issues became so complex that the ordinary court system just didn't have expertise or knowledge or familiarity with those issues, and they couldn't adjudicate them very well. So this specialized land use court came into existence, and it's been wonderful because they're familiar with the issues. That's been key. And also we've had state agency coordination, which is really important. Every state agency has to abide by the state land use planning program. And at least in the early years, they were familiar with it. So they would not adopt policies to conflict with DLCD's policies. Today, those agencies are less familiar with it, and they also need to be educated. And that's not all, unless you have some more questions.
Just a little bit more personal question. Do you have recommendations for transmission and distribution planners? How to work with DLCD, how to work with Oregon, there's already environmental impact for siting, but what else can you recommend?
Well, in the few years before I left, there was an effort made on the part of, actually it was the Umatilla County planner who was proposing this effort. And right now, major utility line corridors are a use. It's pretty much an outright permitted use in EFU zones. There's a little bit of guidance, but what would I think be really helpful would be is if those lines aren't allowed on high value farmland. Right now they're only allowed on farmland if there's no other reasonable route. Okay, understandable. But they shouldn't be allowed to go through high value farmland if there's another reasonable route through other farmland. So that's been a bill that's been attempted to be gotten through the legislature for a few years running. I don't know what the status of it is now, but I think that, and there could be exceptions to the rule, but by and large, for example, Umatilla County has a lot of rangeland, but also has a lot of great circle pivot agriculture right there, right there near and near Boardman, and that's just. And those transmission lines are definitely a challenge for circle irrigation pivots and low-flying planes, spraying, and things like that. So that would be that'd be a good thing. And also, again, some kind of effort to allow for the regional planning of these lines. It just doesn't make sense that each county, has its own. I mean, it's problematic for the providers. It's problematic for I think the industry would probably prefer a single cohesive approach. I mean, the industry often has to deal with federal lands as well. You've got the federal lands, and then you've got all these different counties along the way. So yeah, I think those two things, there's some kind of regional planning process and some reasonable ability to site these lines off of high-value farmland. I mean, the rangeland doesn't have nearly the conflicts that the high-value farmland has, especially with irrigation. Yeah.
And do you have any recommendations for farmers who want to start or maintain a farm over the next 30 years in Oregon? Where they should go, how they could be successful, and any tools.
Oh my goodness, okay. Getting a little out of my territory, but I do know that it can be hard to start a new farm, getting the financing, finding the land. There are some entities out there that can help with that. I know that Nellie McAdams' group, the Rogue Farm Corps, does training for new farmers, startup farmers.
Say they have lots of training, but they.
Yeah. There's also a small farms program out of OSU that has a lot of resources available and has regular conferences. A lot of the young people going into farming are not necessarily interested in these much larger farms that have grown historic crops like grass seed or whatever. A lot of them are interested in smaller farms and maybe are growing row crops or something like that. So they're looking for smaller properties. But out of Oregon's, and sometimes they want to divide parcels to do that, but out of Oregon's 35,000 farms, about 25,000 are on parcels smaller than 50 acres. So there are a lot of smaller parcels out there, plenty of smaller parcels out there. So yeah, the Rogue Farm Corps, OSU's small farm program, there might even be through OSU, I'm not sure, a matching program that matches farmers who are on the verge of retiring with, putting them in a mentor position with somebody new, farmers who don't have children or other people who want to continue the farm, but the farmer wants to see the farm stay in farming. I know that there are places across the country that have that kind of mentorship program, and then you work together for a few years and work out some kind of financial transaction to slowly move the farm over time into a new ownership. I'm not quite sure that's available. Nella McAdams would, Farm Corps would know about that. But Oregon has a highly diverse farm climate. We've got over 200 crops that are grown here in Oregon. I mean, you look at a place like Iowa that has, corn and pigs, and that's like about it. So we're very, very diverse, lots of opportunities, which I think makes for a healthy food system here to have all that going. Yeah. There's a lot of work that's being done in communities around the state on local food systems, regional food systems. Some of these new farmers a lot of them are developing, relationships with institutions, supplying schools or prisons or colleges with food, or restaurants with food, direct farm to market, and of course farm markets. So, yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. But I want to thank you so much for chatting with me and for contributing to this dialogue.
You're very welcome. It's been fun. It's been a wild ride, tremendous fun, and very gratifying to feel that I've made a difference together with a lot of other people in a very special state. And I certainly hope things go forward and that we continue to grow new crops of leaders who continue the program.